Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, I want to talk about the one point that almost every GCSE student every year tends to completely forget about writing in an inspector calls. This one point, the moment you're able to include it in your inspector calls essay, not only does it mean that your writing will immediately stand out and you're closer to writing at a grade 6, 7, 8 and 9 level, but actually once you understand this point, your work will also stand out because majority of students either don't really understand this point, nor do they even make an effort to include it in their essays in an inspector calls. So what is this one point that every single student studying an inspector calls always forgets, and how will including it in your writing immediately make your work stand out? This is the most forgotten, ignored, misunderstood context point in the inspector calls. That is to do with feminism, okay? Now remember, in terms of Priestley, when he wrote this play, and in terms of what messages he was trying to impart to his audience, on the one hand, we all know that he was trying to push forward a message of socialism, this criticism of capitalism, how it leads to inequality and society needs to become more socialist. But really, integral to that message and going together with that message, and this is what a lot of people forget that Priestley was, is he was also a feminist, and he was also conveying a feminist message of change to his audience. Now, one thing I want to mention, and this is why this idea is so misunderstood. Lots of people, when they think of the idea of feminism, they always think that feminists are women who hate men and don't shave their legs. That is not feminism. Feminism is the idea that women and men should be equal. If you believe that women and men should be treated the same, if you believe that boys and girls should be treated the same, they should be able to do the same things, then that means you are a feminist. And Priestley, when he wrote this play and even deliberately chose women as its victims, okay? He wanted to demonstrate that also a capitalist society, intrinsic to it, which makes it a very patriarchal society, is it also crushes women. And he wanted to impart a feminist message of change. In fact, not only was Priestley a feminist, but he was using Inspector Gall as his mouthpiece. Remember that when Inspector Gall appears, he gives voice to Eva Smith and Daisy Renton, who lack a voice, right? They are the women who are part of the underclass of society. They are mistreated and ultimately ignored. And Inspector Gall says, no, we're not going to ignore them anymore. I'm going to come here and tell you guys what they are going through and show you not only why it's terrible what you've done to them, but also society is going to be unstable and we're going to keep on facing all of these problems if we don't change how we treat women. That is part of Priestley's core message. People forget this, okay? So people only think, oh, that therefore means it's just about socialism. But remember, it's also really important that Priestley deliberately chose women as victims in this play, because the other side of his socialist coin was this idea of feminism. And Inspector Gall, who was his mouthpiece, Priestley's mouthpiece, defended both Eva and Sheila, okay? So obviously Eva is the most obvious victim in the play, but actually Sheila is also a victim, right? Think about how she's treated by Gerald Croft. Even to a lesser degree, her father. She's also infantilized by her family. She also is a victim, okay? So that's really, really important. And you need to talk about this and how women are presented as victims within this play. Not all of the women, but two of the central characters. This is Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, and of course, Sheila Burling, okay? You need to talk about that. And the moment you do, that immediately puts your essay at a cut above the rest, because you are showing not only analysis, but you're also showing a level of perceptiveness that a lot of students just don't understand or don't even know is even an idea and a context point that Priestley really wanted to incorporate. By the way, if you find this helpful and you're like, okay, this is really helpful, but how do I incorporate this into an essay? Don't forget that on the 29th of October, during October half-term week, I'll be running a one-off Inspector Calls GCSE masterclass. Within that lesson, I'm going to be writing 2 grade 9 model answers. And of course, as it's a live lesson, you can ask me as many questions as you want. And all students who join that not only will have access to those live model answers that they can use to revise from for the mocks, but ultimately GCSE exams. But I've also created a 3-page cheat sheet that lots of my students last year found super useful and they turned to throughout the year, and ultimately in the summer exams, and they found it super helpful. So make sure you join in. Now, when it comes to this point, this is how you incorporate it when you're considering the characters in the play. Firstly, of course, there's Eva Smith, right? Remember, when you're talking about why this idea of feminism is so integral and so important when we consider her character, remember that society, or rather she's used to demonstrate how society victimized working class women, and she highlights the unequal pay rights that women had. Remember that, of course, women at the time that this play was set, which was in 1912, they didn't have the right to vote and they didn't have equal pay rights, right? So women only got the right to vote in 1918. And Eva Smith is being used to highlight how women were really, really underpaid and mistreated, okay? And of course, society punished women like her who wanted to be independent. They wanted to stand up for themselves. They wanted to rally for their own rights. Society actually ultimately punished them for trying to exercise any form of power or independence. Priestley was trying to show that this is wrong. Of course, the other character that you need to also see, as obviously she is an aggressor, okay, so she does victimize Eva Smith, but she's also a victim too. This is Sheila, okay? And these are the points that you should make when you're considering this idea of feminism relating to Sheila's character. So, talk about how she highlights how many upper middle class women needed the protection of marriage for stability. In other words, she, of course, when the play opens, it's a celebration of her engagement with Gerald. And she wasn't happy with Gerald because he just ghosted her the previous summer. But she had to accept that because she needed the protection of marriage. And Priestley was even trying to show from the beginning that Gerald, basically, who had disproportionate power to her, he basically abused this power. And that's the reality for many women at the time who were married to men who basically abused their power, treated them anyhow, and these women had to stay married to them for some form of social, financial stability. And Priestley is using Sheila's character to criticize this. And of course, her change, especially towards the end, so she goes from obviously being very naive, her head is up in the clouds, a little bit childlike, and actually she becomes quite perceptive. She experiences a moral awakening and also decides to ultimately walk away from her engagement. And Priestley was trying to show that actually her change shows women were capable of both moral strength, of independence, and women actually should not be underestimated as being seen as flighty, foolish, and not equal to what men can do, okay? So don't forget this context point. Most students tend to do so, and most students tend to get super average performance in Inspector Calls, but it won't be you as long as you incorporate this into your Inspector Calls essays. And of course, if you join in my October half-term Inspector Calls one-off masterclass, you can simply ask me as many questions as you want related to this or any other aspect of Inspector Calls. And of course, I'll also show you how to incorporate it into a top winning grade 9 model answer. Thanks so much for watching.